Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to join us at this panel. We are at a small table here in the center, but I think we feel ourselves to be at a bigger, rounder table with you. So thank you very much for joining us. And I know that the way you join us is you have to have your headsets, because otherwise, how can we hear ourselves with this movement around us? But we are certainly at the heart of the Paris Peace Forum this morning. So I couldn't be more delighted to be with you, and to be delighted to be bringing the subject of biodiversity and COP15 and the COP15 biodiversity moment, which is imminent upon us, into the Paris Peace Forum. We all know, don't we, that the world, policymakers, corporates, and even the public imagination has been captured by the race to net zero. We know the carbon problem. We know that we have to make it. And although the experts have been telling us for a long time that we should be concerned about the biodiversity problem, the world is in a sense only now beginning to get their heads to the imperative of managing a biodiversity crisis. So it's very important to bring this into the context of the Paris Peace Forum, which is looking at how different actors can move in on these big subjects that challenge the world. I have a really fantastic panel with me here this morning, and I'm very proud to be sitting alongside them. So let me introduce you to them, and then we'll get started. I have on my left Laura Weisbisch, who is actually with the Igarape Institute in Brazil. That means right in one of the global hotspots of the question of biodiversity. And you are working, I think, on the emerging development challenges, both social and environmental, that are in the Amazon basin. And your own research looks at the sort of global South-South collaborations that are possible to address this. On my right, I have Andy Howard, who is the Global Head of Responsible Investment, Sustainable Investment at Schroders, the asset management house, which has a global overview, 37 offices around the world and thousands of investment professionals. So a very good partnering at opposite ends of the spectrum with Laura on my left. Paulina Murphy is with the World Benchmarking Alliance, where you are head, I think, of the outreach part of it and the advocacy part of it. And the Benchmarking Alliance is about how we bring public sector to respond to challenges like this. And we have Farid Barash beside me, who is actually a co-founder as well as CEO of CSAPA. CSAPA is a social purpose organization that works with organizations like yourself, big investment houses and companies, on how they respond to these challenges. So I think each person here has a different but overlapping and complementary point of view. So as we get started, I'm going to turn to you, Laura, first, because surely the world is looking at the Amazon basin. And here you are in the hotspot, really, globally, of where climate change, deforestation, biodiversity come together, including with communities on the ground. Could you just give us a snapshot for a moment of how you see it unfolding in reality in this place in the world?
Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to be here. So let me take you to this journey, very brief journey to the Amazon, which indeed, it's probably one of these hotspots where at least 3 environmental planetary crises are unfolding: the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis. And on top of that, I must say, there's another social and illegality crisis taking place right now. So maybe if we are all kind of used to see the Amazon as this one place that we need to protect for the climate purposes of it, for biodiversity, for pollution, we also need to think about the Amazon as this hotspot of organized crime. Nowadays, over 90% of deforestation in the Amazon is illegal. And when I say that, I'm not only mentioning, the loss of forest. I'm also talking about what we call an ecosystem of environmental crime. So there are multiple overlapping environmental and non-environmental illegalities that are taking place right now. It means illegal logging, illegal mining, land grabbing, agriculture tainted with illegalities, but also corruption, fraud, social violence. So yes, we see the Amazon as this hotspot of overlapping environmental crisis, but it's also about the social crisis and the governance crisis that is taking place over there.
So if we just pause there for a moment. It's almost overwhelming to describe it, isn't it? How do you get started? I mean, I know that the Igarape Institute, it has a selected project by Paris Peace Forum, for which congratulations, you've been one of the selected impact projects for 2022, in which you've been looking really at the sustainable growth and responsible capital piece of it. So that's for you presumably a good place to start. How do we start to tackle this?
Yeah. So organizations like the Igarape, which are think and do tanks, we consider that it's important to showcase what's happening and to really get the dynamics, the scope and scale right, but also to try to help actors to find the solution, right? We're not only here to flag the problems, we're also here to help both public and private actors to do better.
Where do they start? What are you doing? I think data is a big part of your story.
Exactly. So I mean, part of the response is actually to understand the context and data. So here at the Paris Peace Forum, what we are doing is that we are soft launching the Sustainable Amazon Dashboard, which is a platform that we compile data coming from public sources and also NGOs and think tanks like ourselves to try to shed a light on the dynamics on the ground. So I guess people that are familiar with the private sector language know the expression "know your client," right? I mean, there's kind of due diligence that how to do business is that know your client. We also think that you have to know your context. And organizations that are based on the ground, like ourselves and our partners, we are not the only ones, can help the private sector, for instance, to know the context they're operating.
What are they actually is happening on the ground?
What exactly? Because more and more, the private sector is familiar or willing to do something, to work differently, to have, to enhance due diligence systems, to have a more responsible behavior. What sometimes is missing, it's to really understand the challenges on the ground, beyond having a more vague and abstract metrics and frameworks and indicators. It's actually to know the challenges and therefore to be meaningful about understanding the context you're operating and the exposure and the risks and the impacts of your activities or the activities of your clients, your partners. So data is definitely part of the...
And reality.
Exactly.
So to turn to you, Andy, it would be fair to say, I think, wouldn't it, that Schroders has really stepped out on natural solutions. And indeed, last week, you announced Plan for Nature. So why? I mean, we know why the world needs it, but why, as an asset manager, are you stepping into that space, and why is that, for you, a solution space?
Well, I think it comes back in some ways to the point you made earlier. There's been a huge amount of focus on climate change, quite rightly, over the last few years. But I think we see it in many ways as being symptomatic of a bigger challenge. And that bigger challenge really is the inevitable conflict between growing demand on the world's resources and finite resources. The natural environment is well past the point of being in credit. We've been operating in deficit. That deficit's getting bigger. That creates risks, that creates opportunities, but fundamentally it requires us as a finance industry to think differently about what our role is. Across a whole range of areas, fundamentally the asset management industry is about connecting capital to areas of need. And there are few greater areas of need than the need to invest in and support the natural environment that we see today. So for us, this is a critical question at an almost sort of philosophical level. And for us, how we think about the way we manage companies, the way we engage companies, the way we allocate capital, I won't pretend that we have all of the answers. We absolutely don't. But I think thinking differently about the questions in today's environment for us is not really a choice. It's how we have to run our business and how we have to behave as investors.
And so you're saying that you can influence the corporates because you're channeling finance that way. How do you influence them? What can you get them to step up and do?
Well, there's really two things that we try to do. First of all, I mean, you mentioned data earlier, and I think we would take the view, I mean, this is where we face an interesting challenge, that we invest in 16,000, 17,000 companies around the world. We look for the frameworks, but we're also very cognizant that actually you can sometimes get lost in data and lose the reality of what may be happening in certain situations on the ground.
What you're saying, yeah.
But what we can do is use that sort of analysis, use that sort of framework to identify where are there companies that are at greater risk or are more having a greater impact on biodiversity, on nature, and use our voice with those companies to push those companies to be more transparent, to establish goals, to establish strategies for how they're going to deliver those goals, and then to hold them accountable for doing that. So over the last 3 years, we've had just over 200 engagements with large exposed companies around the world on how they're managing biodiversity exposure and biodiversity impacts within their business. And that's something really that we try to do across all of the portfolios that we manage. And the second thing we can do is to create new ways of investing and new kinds of investment vehicles. So we announced a couple of months ago a joint venture with Conservation International based in Southeast Asia, which will really be about investing in nature in that part of the world to really try and open up new pipes and new channels to connect capital. And certainly we hear from our clients around the world that they want to invest in nature-based solutions and to create the pipes that allow them to do that and to direct that capital to areas that can make a difference.
Amazing. It's a really forefront work in this arena. And I know, Farid, when we were talking, you were saying to me that there's a danger that there's a missing link here, that actually it's got to land in the reality of farmers. Can you talk about that?
Yes, definitely, and happy to be here with all of you. You know, we're coming at XAPA with a different perspective. For us, Aichi target in 2010 were not met. I was part myself of a lot of discussions on zero deforestation commitment made back in 2015 or something, which to the best of my knowledge, and I'd be happy to have your view on that, but I think it's been really a failure. Like no corporation has been really capable to meet zero deforestation target a couple of years ago. So in response, what we've been trying to do through our activities at XAPA with companies and investors has been to onboard that missing link. The missing link is fundamentally to say that if you talk about zero deforestation, you talk about net zero target, you talk about biodiversity preservation on the ground, a farmer, at the end of the day, or a community on the ground in Amazonia, is coming from a different perspective. Need to survive, need to make a living. And there are many things that have to be done at that level to encourage more circularity, more intercropping, diversity of revenues, a lot of things that enable to secure resilient community activities, enabling to make more money on the ground, enabling to fight, for example, the corruption or governance issues, or to force the local buyers to consider that at some point some activities are illegal and should not be bought. So this is kind of the missing link that we are trying to focus on. We do this combining three things fundamentally, in combination with a lot of high-tech and very smart digital systems that are deployed. We're trying to equip these communities and people with low-tech, simple solutions that are accessible.
Even at the small farmer level?
Yes. And the reason why is to make sure that those people are equipped and aware. They can get trained, have access to information. They can identify or flag issues, for example. So that's one aspect. They can take part in the data collection process, one way or another. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is obviously that we work closely on this question of building the right financial mechanisms to support that. If we take about net zero, for example, there are technical itineraries that can onboard people starting from where they need in terms of improving yields, maximizing biomass production and carbon sequestration, which ultimately, after generating additional revenues and securing or kind of forcing people to become more resilient at their level, enable them to be qualified as carbon assets.
So one of the things I'm hearing, which is very powerful, is that actually there's this training and capacity building thing that needs to happen alongside the data and disclosure, and the two together help to create that missing link.
The question being to find the right recipe between, and I will just close on that for now, but finding the right recipe between onboarding meaningfully that missing link, which requires a lot of on-the-ground effort, and at the same time finding the right recipe to ensure replicability and scalability.
Got it.
Which is exactly why we are focusing extensively on the digital platform that we're using, which enables to play with complexity and scale, and also with financial mechanisms, enabling obviously to bring the additional capital required beyond what private sector, a brand or whatever can do on its own.
It's an interesting thing. to listen to this conversation, Paulina, with your work in mind on benchmarking, because surely the common factor coming through just so loudly is data. And what, from your point of view, in the benchmarking alliance is actually the role of data? What are we trying to do by gathering this data?
Thank you. And just listening to the conversation, I agree with everything, and it's just so exciting. So benchmarking, for us to have effective benchmarks and for us to understand what companies are doing, where priority actions need to focus, we need robust, good quality data. The data can't just focus on the headquarters of the company. It has to go through the value chain. Mm-hmm. And getting that good quality data is incredibly difficult, particularly in biodiversity and nature, where understanding corporate impacts on the ground, it's a novel approach. So we kind of know what we're doing on climate. We know what we need to measure in terms of emissions. We know we need scope 1, 2, and 3. But having a similar kind of understanding of nature impacts is very difficult, and we're not just there yet.
Yes, so it's just the very beginning, and the point of the impacts, presumably, the point of understanding it is to drive action. How do you help that happen? Because you're really there to bring the private sector into responding to the Sustainable Development Goals. What kind of action do you think they should be taking?
Exactly, because if you have a benchmark but it's an academic exercise, nothing changes.
Yeah.
So having good disclosure, having full transparency, and that's it, nothing happens. So when we look at, through our benchmarks, when we look at issues, and for example, in our nature transformation, we look at land and sea use change, direct exploitation of resources, pollution, so all the things that Laura was mentioning in terms of the crisis in the Amazon. We also look at indigenous land rights, the just transition that needs to happen in nature.
Enormous number of things.
All these number of things, but that's so pulling this together in a methodology and then launching or the assessments of what are companies actually doing, that's then the findings hopefully inform companies themselves of where their disclosures are not up to standard, where they are not good enough, strong enough to support the discussions with policymakers in terms of a global biodiversity framework that needs to be put into place. Or for investors, you need to know what to engage the companies on, what issues. So that's the idea.
Can I ask a provocative question? Maybe I'll aim it at you first, which is everybody's looking for data, and when you list them, the issues one's dealing with, the list goes on and on. And as you say, companies and governments are far behind in comparison to where we are on climate, and climate we need to be further ahead. So is it possible that sometimes the lack of data is used as an excuse, Andy, and actually can we get on anyway, or do we have to wait for data?
I totally agree that using a lack of data for a reason for inaction makes no sense. I mean, it's true in pretty much every area of, maybe this is coming at this as an investor, but pretty much every area of investment you're dealing with imperfect data, and you're making judgments, you're making decisions that are as right as you can get them. And I think when we think about something like the question of biodiversity, exposures and impacts, we certainly don't have all of the information we would like. What's really critical is that you frame the question of what question are we trying to answer?
Yes.
What information can we find that will help us answer that question? Recognize the shortfalls in that information, and then try and work to improve that over time. So I think when we think about this, we have very little understanding of individual company supply chains. It's just not disclosed. What we can do is we can look at different industries and get a view of to what degree is that industry exposed to different countries, exposed to different other industries. And we can take an imprecise but approximate view of, well, therefore, companies in this industry are probably indirectly exposed in this way without capturing the nuance. We can then use that to try and understand where to engage and where to push for more transparency and try and create that sort of virtuous circle of better understanding, better engagement, better disclosure.
So in fact, it's a sort of dynamic picture you're painting. It's not a static picture. And certainly I think one of the things in the debate is it's very often described as if there's data or there's not data, where it's the creation of data. And
I think it is worth just highlighting, particularly in this area, over the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot of initiatives launched. You've got TNFD in particular comes to mind, which is a sort of nature version of they probably don't like me framing it this way, but sort of, as the name would imply, molded to some degree on TCFD, which has been hugely successful in the climate arena. There are a number of other initiatives, a number of other frameworks. None of them are perfect. What we've tried to do at Schroders is to establish a framework of how do we think we measure exposure, how do we think we measure how companies are managing their exposure and their impacts, and pulling together data from CDP, forest surveys, from TNFD, from Encore, from our own data sources to try and put that together as best we can. But I think that, the point is, it is a virtuous circle, but there is absolutely enough information to get started.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I know that if your information is really what's going on the ground, do you have any cause for optimism? Is anything changing? Where are we looking for some kinds of solutions? What would be your take on that?
I think we have to be both optimistic, but also concerned that we're not doing enough. And I guess there is really a lack of political will and corporate will to go beyond what is there. And I fully agree that whatever data we get, it's imperfect. But probably valuing partnerships that are able to take us there and to keep improving and be meaningful about willing to do differently, it's very important. I guess there is cause for optimism when we see the discussion about bioeconomy, for instance, in the Amazon, right? So we are not only flagging problems. This is not only Igarapé Institute, this is the whole community of people working in the Amazon. They are both thinking about pointing the problems and speaking truth to power and corporations about things that are not enough.
What does the bioeconomy mean? What do you mean?
Yeah, okay. So I guess in the case of the Amazon, right, I mean, it means economic activities that are compatible with a standing forest. And when we say about, a standing forest, it's not only the forest itself, but also the different people and communities and knowledges that live around. So bioeconomy is to shift the current paradigm that actually kind of prospers in destroying the forest, right?
Is there any sign of that actually happening in the Amazon?
Yes, they are. But I guess there are a couple of examples of, different kind of production and produce commodities actually that could go that are compatible with a standing forest. Some of them are fruits, other are nuts. There is low carbon agriculture. There is biotech in a completely different way. There is the whole industry 4.0. But what I want to make sure here is that scale matters, right? So we actually need mainstream to be bioeconomy. We need agroforestry to be mainstream rather than monocultures.
And what about, say, cattle ranching? I mean, that's a huge arena. Are there signs of any change in that arena?
Yes, there are. I mean, there is definitely scientific advance in terms of low carbon cattle ranching. But this is an ongoing competition between models. So we need more private and public investment in order for this low carbon agriculture and low carbon cattle ranching to be mainstreamed. We don't need more, in the case of the Amazon, we definitely don't need the expansion of the agricultural frontiers into forest land. What we need is to stop deforestation, improve productivity in whatever is already there, and assume that enlarging the areas for agricultural production and cattle ranges into forest areas is just the worst business decision one can take.
Yeah, that's what you're saying. It's an exposure. And I was thinking, Farid, that actually when you were speaking earlier, you were very much looking at scalable solutions. There's lots of tiny signals of things, but the answer needs to be scalable. And I was fascinated to hear you say, we tried in 2015 and we failed. Because certainly my experience is lots of people have tried and failed, which is why the idea of the missing link, what is it that's making them fail and how do you scale up? Your capacity building is the answer to that, is it?
Yeah, and I think the trying and failing happens.
Yeah, we've got to start somewhere, right?
The question is what we learn from that. And as a response to that, I think obviously that anything that looking, for example, as benchmark, it's very good because companies at the end of the day are emulated. So it's a good way to push further the interest of companies to think harder. Another thing that goes beyond what we're doing ourselves is compliance. and increasingly to be optimistic, if I might believe that, that definitely supports reasons to be optimistic. The European Union, among others, is particularly active with the EU directive on deforestation. And increasingly for investors, through a taxonomy that is calling for a principle of do no significant harm, meaning that at the end of the day, when you're an investor, you need increasingly to be capable to prove that across the activities where you invest, the asset and the management that you have, you must prove that you do not infringe human rights in Amazonia, which changes a little bit the discussion. So from a scale perspective, I think those compliance questions, on the one hand, the benchmarks building more emulation on the other hand are good to support more scalability for programs. Then, just the last point, I mean, for what we're doing ourselves, I think the point about data is important for scalability. And for this point, I think a landscape approach, which is not about exploring, having perfect data, but it's about finding the right smart data capable at landscape level to say whether one way or another we are on a good trajectory or not is what matters at the end of the day. And for the missing link, a landscape approach is about fundamentally onboarding and defining criteria, indicators that align interests of multiple stakeholders. And aligning interests of multiple stakeholders is about making sure that along the value chain today, what is increasingly pressuring for corporations is access to raw materials in compliance with regulation. So that's something that is important far away from the ground. And on the ground, the question is whether people want to keep working on, for example, this raw material in a way where they can make a decent living. And for the forum where we are today, I think another question for policymakers actually also about how to ensure that a landscape approach enables to mitigate risks of conflict.
Yes.
Because increasingly we are in a world where, in a climate-constrained world, where those conversations about biodiversity preservation fundamentally one way or another are under pressure of climate change.
Yeah.
Amplifying significantly risks of conflict.
Yes.
So scaling is about finding those right limited data, those right landscape level programs that can be funded, aligning interests of those stakeholders for meaningful improvement of practices on the ground, securing compliance of people far away.
So to bring that round, as you were mentioning, the benchmarking, it strikes me, Paulina, that there's something that you were introducing into the conversation, which is an impatience. We've heard very quietly here, there needs to be more political will, there needs to be more corporate will. If you look ahead, do you think that the kinds of regulations that are coming through, the kinds of frameworks that are coming through, need to be mandatory, or can we begin with something which is voluntary?
Oh, Lucy, I love that question, Lucy. Thank you.
Good. What's the answer?
I am hopeful. So I would love to sit here and say voluntary initiatives will make the change. I don't believe it. I think we need mandatory change. We don't have enough time to sit around and discuss and then discover that it shouldn't be mandatory from the get-go.
Yeah.
There is some excellent work being led by the EU. They're going a bit faster. They have a taxonomy being developed that looks at nature holistically. Climate is a part of that. But I think, so the COP15 in just a few weeks' time, that is, we need a strong market signal from the politicians and make certain actions mandatory now in which the private sector can step in and really lead the way. So
it's a sort of combination of the political policy framework forcing it and the corporates stepping up to it.
Exactly.
I'm going to take questions in a moment or two if anybody has questions, but I would just like to turn to both of you gentlemen, because you're actually, in different ways, investing in new solutions. Impact investing is part of your program, isn't it, at Schroders? What for you is the power of impact investing? And I'll just take a view from each of you on that.
Well, I mean, impact investing, which is really about investing with an intention of creating a positive social or environmental outcome, which sort of sounds like, when you stop and say it out loud, sounds like, well, it should all be like that, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
And the reality is that an awful lot of investment is done into companies or done in a way that hasn't paid nearly enough attention to what impact does that investment have in the real world. And I think, for us, there's a critical question for our industry in terms of how does it think about what we're here to do. Is this simply about financial metrics and performance of funds, performance of individual investments, or is this ultimately about trying to connect, as I mentioned earlier, capital to real-world solutions and doing that in a way that's reframes what investment is here to do?
And you've been making some investments, haven't you?
Absolutely.
Can you give us an example of that?
Absolutely. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about Icaria, our joint venture in Southeast Asia, specifically in the sphere of nature. Similar investments actually in Brazil that we're working on, as well as elsewhere around the world. So there is a lot of focus on how do we get a better understanding of the interaction, the relationship. And if I sort of look at all of this for a while, we sort of talk about social and environmental outcomes, community benefits on the one hand, and then we sort of talk about financial returns and financial theory on the other hand. Those two things are intrinsically linked. Unless investments are being done in a way that is ultimately sustainable to communities, to societies, to the stakeholders of the companies that we're investing in, they won't prove to be sustainable investments. And our very firm starting point is that we start from a world in which the sort of political action that we talk about needing to happen more quickly, and that's probably true, is almost going to be inevitable over time. The question is when, and will it be quick enough? But companies, the private sector, doesn't operate in a vacuum where the costs of that operation, the costs of that sector, can keep on getting bigger and bigger and imposing more and more damage and more costs on the environment or on societies and communities around the world. That's an unsustainable situation. It will change. Hopefully it'll change quicker rather than more slowly, but ultimately for us, understanding which businesses are sustainable as companies come under more pressure to behave in a responsible way and a sustainable way is just common sense investing.
I'll come to you in just a moment, if I may, but I'd like to just check, are there questions from the floor? Because I wouldn't want to miss out. If there's a question over here. I'll come to you in a moment.
Hi, Stuart Patrick,
Hi.
the Carnegie Endowment. Stuart Patrick, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Fantastic discussion. I'm doing a lot of work on biodiversity and nature-related investments in natural capital. As you were talking, I was thinking about there's been a big conservative push in the United States, as you know, against quote-unquote woke capitalism, but also some pushback on the notion of climate-related financial disclosures, which is being mooted by the SEC. And I predict that there would be similar types of pushback for the suggestions of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures as well. How do you see the array of corporate forces? Obviously, we've got the Schroders perspective that look as institutional investors, asset managers, we need to pay attention to this. Undoubtedly, there are lots of parts of the corporate sector, fossil fuel extraction companies, all sorts of others, maybe agricultural companies that are totally against this sort of thing. I obviously want to see things going in the direction you're talking about. How do you see the lay of the land evolving?
Do you mean how do you see the lay of the land, or what needs to happen in the face of the forces that are coming?
Let's go the latter, but they're related.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to turn to you first because of your breadth of view across the corporate sector. We've seen it starting to happen in climate. People are often talking of it as a backlash. There's momentum in one direction, and so people are pulling the other. If we were anticipating that coming through on the nature-based solutions, what should we do? How should we respond?
So this is why I already said we need mandatory disclosures. Because there is that backlash, and if certain baselines are done on a voluntary basis, you don't have to implement, and we don't have time for that. But if we get a really strong global biodiversity framework, which is being negotiated now, and that mandates certain actions from all different stakeholders, so it has to include finance. Finance flows are in the Paris Agreement, but there was no real clarity of what would be the actions that have to be taken forward. And it's taken all this time. Discussions are still going on the climate side of actually what should finance, private finance, how can it step in? On nature, let's get that clarity from the get-go and get it into the negotiated text, which can then be implemented and mandated by governments around the world.
So what I'm hearing is even if there is lashback, push for the mandatory flow. And I think, Andy, you wanted to come in on that.
I was just going to say as well, we've been fairly caught up as a firm in some of that, the points were raised about the sort of bifurcation within the US. I would say actually this is to some degree symptomatic of a trend, probably less pronounced, that's happening everywhere. That you are seeing more parts of society polarizing to a certain degree. I would argue that the part that's bigger is the part that is concerned about nature, that is concerned about climate, and that's the part that's growing more quickly. Certainly what I can say we see in our funds and our investments is that we continue to see strong demand and strong investment in more sustainable funds, more climate-focused funds, more nature-focused funds, and ultimately people are voting with their wallets. On the positive side, it's the first time I've ever been called woke, which I was quite pleased about.
But I think that's interesting because I'm hearing it's a mixture of mandatory push for the mandatory, and at the same time keep the finance flowing in that direction. You have a thought also on the question?
Maybe just one additional comment here. I think there's a principle from financial perspective, not put all your eggs in one basket. Mm-hmm. So no matter whether you care, you think it's important or not, what we're trying to do, at least, is to complement a lot of the impact investment-related approaches with landscape approaches, where at the end of the day, any company with stake in some areas at some point can find interest in investing in one same pot. And then the system is mostly about combining multiple sources with institutional or private investors combined with blended finance mechanisms supported by multilateral agencies and that kind of things. And at the end of the day, just the idea is obviously this may not attract everyone, but it's we're trying to push as far as possible the moment when it is obvious for anyone that it has an interest to take part in those kinds of approaches.
I think it's interesting because you mentioned blended finance there, and actually the feeling that this is about bringing sectors together and building solutions from the ground up. Have we got any other questions? Just needing to check before. There's somebody else? Hello? Hi.
Yeah,
Thank
hi.
you for pointing it out.
Yeah, hi. I'm Blend, belong to indigenous people in Cambodia, and it's great discussion here. Yeah, really interested because it's related to my indigenous community in Cambodia, and as you know that there are a lot of investment of company in my indigenous community, but there are a lot of problems of a company that brings for indigenous people when they invest in the indigenous people. So my question is how to balance between investment and good governance in indigenous people, because a lot of problems when the company invests in the indigenous people. So I hope you got my question, right? Yeah,
I think
thank you so much.
And Laura, I wonder if that's one we could hand to you, the issue of how you work with the indigenous populations of an area and invest in solutions at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And I guess this is the most critical issue, because there is no nature without people, right? I mean, we can be sources, the humans, we can be sources of the problem. A lot of the crises are anthropogenic. But also, I mean, if you want to preserve nature, we want to discuss about biodiversity, we also take into consideration that there are people. Different regions have different regulations, and I guess when someone brings, the issue of, Cambodia and the ways in which companies might be investing in regions where there are indigenous people, their rights are not being protected, there's eventually not prior free consent. These are governance issues that needs to be taken into account. And these are not only, because we are in a roundtable discussing corporate issues rather than, governance from a public sector perspective. This is a responsibility of everyone. I guess sometimes, and a lot of times, if I take the example of the Amazon, but definitely in Cambodia as well, there is a discussion of, well, the government is not doing its own role. I mean, I'm only here because I was allowed to be here. And I think in the 21st century, 2022, there is no room for private sector and investors. They are just disregarding human rights or indigenous people's rights just because maybe regulation is not playing out the way it should be.
Yes.
Right? So I just want to point out, otherwise it becomes like a kind of a game blaming situation.
I also
right?
felt that I learned from you when I was talking with you earlier that actually you're looking at something like a question of enforcement, because where you're saying there's a ramp up of illegality, very often the laws are there, they're not enforced. So transparency is a driver to that. I think transparency on all fronts.
Maybe just an additional comment. I think that a question here is actually also the role of private sector to enter, I'd say, some sort of public debate. And I think a question is, if I'm an investor, I need to take stand and encourage governments
Yes.
to respect human rights. And at the end of the day, I would not frame that in an ethical manner, but I think this issue about respect and inclusion of indigenous communities is typically one of those topics where, from an international investor perspective, the question is, in absence of factoring this consideration population into any program, anything the government wants to do and is looking for international investment for, raises issues, business issues. Yes. In terms of enforcement. Amazonia is a very good example where at the end of the day, then any money that is brought on the ground is not used meaningfully. Matter of compliance. And so a question here is how those private sector institutions force governments to respect human rights. And if they don't do that, there are other jurisdictions which don't necessarily care about that. So then governments may look at other jurisdictions.
There's a role for the private sector to help push governments in this direction.
To
So we've got a
exam,
few
yes.
moments, just a few moments. And I'm going to ask you all one question. COP15 is coming up. It will be on the international stage in a way. What should we be hoping that corporates put into COP or take out of COP15? What is the thing that we need to get the corporates to do around COP15? I'm going to start with you, Laura. Very quick.
I'm going to take this one word, which is ambition, right? I mean, we've heard we took from the climate experience that we need to keep working with ambition. In the COP15 biodiversity, it's that we are starting from a lower point. We are not even, I mean, we need to get this ambition that it's coming from, the public sector.
Ambition and speed.
And speed, exactly. This is also learned from...
Yeah, when you're saying we've learned from climate.
We learned from
so
climate.
ambition and speed. Farid, what would you say?
We're entering a recession time. Compliance, I think, is one thing I would really call very strongly. And compliance, meaning mandatory approaches and landscape indicators that have to be smart.
Things that are on the ground
Yes.
that we can actually see happen. Andy?
I think where we are at the moment, what we need really is the private sector to be able to send a clear signal to government that we would like to see more clarity, we want to see more action towards the ambition that governments have and how we get there. We're too early at this point, in my opinion, to have mandated action. We can mandate transparency, and that would be a huge step.
Great. Paulina?
Well, fully support that. But then I think for companies to go there and be ready to disclose along your value chain. And we know how difficult that is, but that's where we're going. So to share best practice amongst each other and with governments so that we have a collaborative solution to how we get there.
I have to say that I've learned a lot even in this conversation myself, and I hope it's been illuminating for some people. It is one of the biggest subjects. We've got used to climate being the biggest subject. Biodiversity is going to take its place on the stage. And I think that for people listening, isn't it powerful to hear how much data is going to push this through? But it's not just data, it's disclosure for action, is what I've heard from all of you. And that the action is coming partly driven by the public sector, but crucially, the private sector can push it along and the financial flows will drive it. But I think that you two have spoken up very powerfully about the solutions coming up from the ground that need to be practical, transparent, and scalable. So I've learned a lot from you, and I would like to thank you very much. And I would like to ask our audience to thank our guests. Thank you very much. Fascinating conversation.